Can AI replace doctors and nurses? And what are the limits of evidence when it comes to clinical practice?
And my fear about artificial intelligence is this pseudo certainty that it's going to persuade people that we know more than we actually do, or that we can actually ever learn. And then I raise the question is, when will we start to think that AI is the sort of entity that we as humans ought to abdicate all of our judgment over to? But has the point of human existence been for it to be easy? Or is struggling to understand something with your own limited resources the task of living?
I see AI as evidence-based medicine on steroids.
But that data doesn't necessarily connect into the life world experienced by either a clinician or a patient. And I hate to disabuse Robert Kennedy Jr., equipping everybody with wearables is not going to bridge that gap. But there's just such a strong belief now that if we fit everybody with a wearable to collect real-time data on a 24/7 basis, that we're going to somehow improve people's health. I think that's a complete wrong direction to go, but that's where we're at. It's a form of reductionism as well that I resist, because I think that, you can't simply reduce someone's human experience to the measured bits of information coming out of their sensor, right?
Yeah.
We also have a public that's frustrated with wait times and difficulty getting access that would happily accept a bot. Would that be, so I'm just really showing my age and my bias towards human-centered care. Would they receive good care? I'm not sure if it's good. It strikes me that if you're going to be in charge of human-centered AI, we know what AI is. Do we know what humans are? What's good for the disease might not be good for the patient.
Mm-hmm.
If you can convince them that medicine is thoroughgoingly imprecise and fallible, not what they read about or see on television.
Concepts with Shawn Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Shawn Whatley. Today we have Dr. Ross Upshur with us, who is head of the Division of Clinical Public Health at the Dalla School of Public Health. He's also a professor at the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the Temerity Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. Ross has studied the interface between theory and practice in medicine for over 30 years. Before starting medicine, he got a master's in philosophy. And so he brought a philosophical mind to the study of medicine. Early in his career, he was at the forefront of the development of evidence-based medicine. So a lot of his work was tied right in with what has made Canada famous on the medical scene. Evidence-based medicine is a proud Canadian invention. Evidence-based medicine is really what it means to practice medicine today. There's no such thing as non-evidence-based medicine. And really, evidence-based medicine is a powerful approach to using statistics to get us closer to certainty, trying to give us the answer in clinical care that we can apply to patients. Well, Dr. Upshur has applied a philosophical mindset to say, yes, okay, we love evidence and we love these large randomized controlled trials and we love trying to get closer to the truth. However, there is a gap between these large RCTs and what actually happens at the bedside. And the people who are deep inside the evidence-based world, even the founders, Dr. Gordon Guyatt, have said that, we will never have RCTs on clinical care as it applies to some of our most delicate, needy, and complex patients. So the elderly with complex medical problems. We had a fascinating discussion about the difference between learning and practice and the gap between theory and practice, certain knowledge and contingent knowledge. This discussion was heavier than average. We talked about philosophers and philosophical concepts that many people outside of clinical medicine and even philosophers themselves probably aren't thinking about on an everyday basis, but I think they are essential. So once again, thank you for stopping by. I'd love to hear what you think. Please take a moment to leave a comment and Don't forget to click like and subscribe. All right, on with the show. Dr. Upshur, welcome.
Well, thank you, Shawn. Welcome. It's good to see you, and thank you for the invitation to be with you today.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm really excited to tap into, I guess it's 30 years of experience for your experience thinking about this issue. And we're trying to focus on AI in medicine, big data, and really I see AI as evidence-based medicine on steroids. And so this quest for certainty. But before we dig into all this stuff, we should start with a patient story. And you give a beautiful patient history in your article, Looking for Rules in a World of Exceptions, Reflections on Evidence-Based Practice. So I wonder if you could situate our discussion in a story.
Yeah, so one of the things that I learned over now almost 40 years of clinical practice is that one of the central tasks of clinical medicine is taking a deeply informed patient history. And I think that's particularly relevant in family medicine. I understand that people in other specialties and disciplines, particularly emergency medicine, are working under massive temporal constraints, having started my career in emergency. But for example, in primary care family medicine, the more you can know about your patient and the more you can understand their lives and all of the different facets that are impinging upon their experience of wellness and illness, the better off you are in the long run. And particularly, as we'll morph in, I think, a little later to a discussion on evidence-based medicine, the only way to know a patient's preferences and values is to know who they are as a person who has a life world behind them. And you may recall from your time in most of my patients had very long stories, right? They were older, they were multimorbid, they had a lot of experience and a lot to communicate. And it was really, I think, the challenge in training physicians to actually have the patients to understand a patient in their fullest form. And the best way to get that is through narrative. And the best way to do that is to ask patients about their lives and their, what's important and what matters. So the patient in the article that I wrote was really quite a remarkable patient. And she had taught all of my residents and taught me an immense amount. She had very delicate health status, and she always found herself caught between the specialists, right? Because for some reason, a little tiny bit of thiazide diuretic would keep her out of heart failure, but her endocrinologist hated it because it moved up her blood sugar. There's a putative link to increasing blood sugar. So I ended up, and this is probably not something one should confess, I said, just don't tell the endocrinologist that you're on thiazide diuretic, because she was an incredibly conscientious person and took very seriously whatever her physicians told her. But she said, every time I stop the thiazide, I go into there. The other thing that was remarkable about her was her clarity about how she wanted to end her days. And she did not want to die of cancer. And she had, as I said, a terrible coronary heart failure, and she developed vaginal bleeding, and she had an endometrial carcinoma. And everybody just said, yeah, we're not going to do anything about that. Your heart's... So she went off to Montreal, where she lived for a long time, to see her old gynecologist. They said, no, we can operate with that. Sure as guns. She came back, she had the operation, she arrested, she went into failure, but she came out of it. And what was motivating her was another patient of mine, which was her adult son who had severe developmental delay, had lived with her entire life, and she needed to make sure that everything was in order with him so that when she passed, he would not be institutionalized. And she managed to make those arrangements and finally succumbed to her cardiac disease, which is the way she wanted to go. Just, it's not up for me to ask a patient why, it's not bad dying of cancer. Everybody in my family's died of cancer. But that she was very clear, very unequivocal. I do not want to die of cancer. So I said, okay, let's try to organize things so that you don't. And she didn't. And that taught me an awful lot. Plus, just such a remarkable spirit. And she had really severe multimorbidity. So I was kind of figuring things out as we went along in terms of her clinical management. So I think that's a really good example of why patient histories make a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Brilliant. A beautiful story. And I encourage people to read the whole thing in that article too. It's fascinating, and you write it so well. So that touches on evidence-based medicine, and that's where we're going to end our discussion. But we wanted to lead with the discussion about AI, and I'm looking at the title of an article, Three Problems with Big Data and AI in Medicine, that you co-authored with Dr. Chin Yi. And so I wanted to ask you, could AI, either today or maybe in the future, provide great care for Mrs. G?
That's a great question. I won't rule out the possibility because things are moving so rapidly. And I have great reservations about the role of AI in healthcare in particular. So I'll start, before answering that question, with why is it that we have accepted AI so eagerly? After decades of managing our relationship with the pharmaceutical industry, all of the articles about dancing with porcupines, and big tech has just walked in, and in terms of capitalization, it's got way more money than big pharma. Looks small compared to big tech. And it's just walked into with open arms, with very little of the kind of regulatory oversight that we so painfully negotiated with the pharmaceutical industry. I think part of the reason is that it's appealing to the healthcare provider's sense of frustration and burnout, right? Like it's held up as, we'll give you AI scribes and this will reduce your burden. Oh, we're going to provide data. And pretty soon, the bigger question is, will we need physicians at all? And I think that's a very big question to ponder. Largely because, as we know in Ontario and across Canada, we have a critical shortage of family physicians and primary care providers. Wouldn't it be better if we just directed them all to bots? And if the bot they can do 90% of the primary care work. And I think we also have a public that's frustrated with wait times and difficulty getting access that would happily accept a bot. Would that be, so I'm just really showing my age and my bias towards human-centered care. Would they receive good care? I'm not sure if it's good. They would receive care of some form. And goodness would be determined by, I guess, you could find some intervention where the measure of outcome would be satisfaction with the bot, and they could, put it on a Likert scale from 1 to dissatisfied and 5, and everybody would say we're satisfied with the bot, and therefore we've got good care. But I think underneath that, we would be losing something very large. And so the paper that we wrote, and huge shout out to Ben Chin Yi, who's a brilliant young man, and he just completed his PhD in philosophy of medicine at Cambridge, and now is on staff at Western. He's a hematologist, oncologist. I tried to get him into family medicine, but so he does bench science as well as he's got a really great understanding of philosophy and history. This paper was written before large language models made their big splash. While all of us were busy during COVID trying to keep our noses above water and trying to keep the population safe, the tech industry was out there perfecting large language models. And they kind of arrived a couple of years ago with a huge splash, and now, of course, multi-billion dollars of investment. So when we were writing that paper, large language models were not part of the horizon. They were kind of a whisper in the background. Mostly future-oriented people talking about these capacities, but there'd never been any demonstration that some of these capacities could actually be brought into reality. So we had three principal challenges. Some of them were epistemological, about theory of knowledge, and I think those remain pertinent because so much of what happens in large language models and even big data, there's a lack of understanding of how the logic works out. So there's a logical and epistemological connection. So just because you have a large volume of data and you're able to come up with an answer doesn't mean that you actually understand what that answer is or how it's justified. And the machine learning was the big thing in the late teens. And so I was thinking mostly about machine learning because I'd spent some time. One of the things I did as a researcher was I had a project at Bridgepoint where we were looking to understand risk in older adults at risk of frailty, which has been a big concern of mine through most of my clinical practice. But the advantage of this was that we created the tool to do this scoring, called it the FAVES tool. So it was frailty and vulnerability assessment. So it combined medical and social data, and we created the data set and we did the analysis according to traditional statistics. So it was something we understood really well. And then we decided, well, let's see what we can get with supervised and unsupervised machine learning. And we got these associations that we were very hard pressed to figure out how they came up with these answers, right? They clustered certain patients together and we could go back to the raw data and see whether there was a medical or a logical connection. And I must say, it turned out to be inexplicable. And that kind of my eyebrows. So imagine that you weren't critical, you didn't have this ability to compare. And the other thing is that a lot of machine learning, as my statistical colleagues will point out, is just using statistical concepts, but with a different language. So it's not just physicians who are feeling displaced by AI, but statisticians, because it comes from a different tradition. Computer science, data analysts, not statisticians. So that led me to some worries about this concept of underdetermination, so that, you might have the prima facie appearance of greater certainty with a large language model or a machine learning approach. But really what you need to do is understand from the bottom up what those data represent. And this is where the phenomenological part of this comes in. So makes a lot of AI and machine learning so appealing are the strong predictive capacity that come out of really incredibly well curated data sets. So for example, we know if you go on Facebook or Apple or Amazon, you can only interact with that data in a certain way. They tell you how to enter the data, which means that their predictive capacity about your interaction is quite high, because you don't have any autonomy or freedom. But that data doesn't necessarily connect into the life world experienced by either a clinician or a patient. And I hate to disabuse Robert Kennedy Jr., equipping everybody with wearables is not going to bridge that gap. But there's just such a strong belief now that if we fit everybody with a wearable to collect real-time data on a 24/7 basis, that we're going to somehow improve people's health. I think that's a complete wrong direction to go, but that's where we're at. So I have skepticism about the epistemological status of large language models. They do have a proponent or a propensity to hallucinate or invent things. And of course, the assurance is, well, if we just throw a few more $1 billion in there, we'll deal with that problem. But it strikes me that this approach to understanding what it means to be a human and to live in a world is completely unrelated to what people actually live and experience. Hmm. And so if we want to put everything in a virtual world, fine, but that's at huge risk.
Yeah, brilliant. And I'm glad you talked about what we actually experience versus what we talk about or theorize. And really, I think you've spent, like you said, the last 40 years trying to figure out this. I think Leo Strauss says it's one of the impossible problems to solve, but the gap between theory and practice. Yeah. And AI is theory on steroids, really. And you mentioned phenomenological. I love phenomenology. I try to read it. I'd not say I understand it, but really, we might, at least with respect to data and AI, we might say it rests on your questioning whether we can presuppose or whether we can presume that human experience is quantifiable. And you're saying, hey, hang on a second. Maybe we can't, not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that is measured that we can measure matters. I've ruined the saying, but no, sorry, go ahead.
And it's a form of reductionism as well that I resist, because I think that, yeah, you can't simply reduce someone's human experience to the measured bits of information coming out of their sensor, right?
Yeah.
Because then this sort of links back to a lot of discussions we've had in the ethics work I do around suffering. So like, we don't have a good measurement of suffering, and we need, so I said, so what, we're going to invent a sufferometer? So somebody comes in and says, I'm suffering, and I put it on their skin, say, sorry, no, the sufferometers, you may think you're suffering, but you're not. There's something like a little wrong about that construction, right? So there's a lot of lived experience or even intersubjective experience that's, to go back to somebody that we've been corresponding about Gadamer, that's intersubjective, right? It's not purely within the realm of subjectivity. It's not something that's objective like science, but it's intersubjective, constructed through language, through tradition. Of course, that doesn't mean that AI can't hijack that. And, in my mind, all bets are off these days because I have no idea the direction that it's going. Interestingly, so here at the U of T, my colleagues, Jennifer Gibson and Jay Shaw, are running it's called the AMS Fitzgerald on human-centered AI. So their next cohort of students. And so what they do is they recruit healthcare leaders who are tasked with integrating AI into their organization. And so I give a talk, which I'm going to do this Thursday. What does it mean to be human? Right? We just stand back and, what does it mean to be human? And I want you to write a page, tell me what it means to be human. And then after your experience, go back to that piece and tell me if you've changed your mind. Because I don't, I've got lots of thoughts. I don't have the definitive answer. But it strikes me that if you're going to be in charge of human-centered AI, we know what AI is. Do we know what humans are?
Wow. Yeah, you're I was going to call you a shit disturber, but
Art had just a slightly subversive tinge to my thinking, right?
Just slightly. So it reminded me of a comment you made in one of your articles about, I think it was the one with Ben on Karl Popper saying, okay, go observe. And observe, and people are like, well, observe what are you talking about? And really you're asking them to say, define human. Well, based on what? And it's an analogous thing. I need to push back a tiny bit though, Dr. Upshur. So you said you were creating a tool, and I got hives when you said that. No, not another clinical tool. I hate clinical. I mean, clinical.
Let's talk about that.
Let's talk about that.
Tools and bad clinical tools.
So I'll give you my OHIP card number, and you can bill for counseling after this. That's what this is. It's an hour of counseling trying to help me with my psychological issues. So just for listeners who aren't in medicine, evidence-based medicine, these huge data sets, you can get promoted in academia and become famous for coming up with a really useful clinical tool. And clinical tools are helpful. So you say, does it hurt here? Yes or no. Does it hurt there? Yes or no. Can you walk 3 steps after the accident? Yes or no. Oh, your ankle is definitely not broken and you don't need an x-ray, and hallelujah, you can go home. And we save the healthcare system a bunch of money. So some healthcare tools definitely are useful. And I would argue that actually all of them have some level of use. However, we get overwhelmed with them, and then AI comes to our rescue. So my question for you, Dr. Upshur, is, can you see a way, like, I don't see a limit to this. And then speaking of Hans Gadamer, you put me onto this book, The Enigma of Health.
Yes.
And I was just actually reading it before we came on the show. I'm also at the same time reading this book. I'm going to interview this author on Friday. Just came out last Monday. The Medium is Still the Message, Marshall McLuhan for Our Time. And of course, McLuhan talked a lot about technology and the impact of technology. And what I misunderstood about McLuhan, I don't know why I didn't get this, but the medium is the message. I always interpreted that as, well, if I tell you something versus if you read something versus if you watch it on a video, you may get a slightly different message from that. And so the medium actually really matters, the medium in which you consume that content. But there's actually a much larger idea there. And I told my wife about it. She said, yeah, well, of course, that everybody knows that. So maybe you already know this, but I didn't know it. It's actually not the format of the content, but it's actually the environment that's created by the format in which you consume.
Yeah.
So he has another term, the ecology of media. And I see these clinical tools as impacting the ecology of medicine. And AI, computers, evidence-based medicine, electronic medical records, change the environment, which in turn changes us as clinicians. So I'm wondering if you've turned your mind to that and whether you are changing me, Dr. Upshur, by creating more of these tools. You are twisting my being.
So let's get into that. That's a great subject for discussion. So one of the things I've been concerned about is clinical judgment. So I've written a couple of papers on clinical judgment, including a chapter in a handbook on philosophy. So I want to ultimately save clinical judgment from its eradication by every other means, it seems, including evidence-based medicine. So why would I be interested in tools? Well, so I'm enough of a scientist to be interested in measurement. And what happened in my clinical experience is that I like to say that I researched my way out of clinical work and then researched my way out of research, largely because if you follow a line of argumentation to its logical conclusion, you find yourself at a horizon where, as you might remember Sean Tracy, who is my closest research associate for a long time. He says, "You just got to slow down, Ross. You're way up here, and everybody else is down here looking, and you've followed this path up here. You've got to show some light on how to get there," because we'd get grants turned down because I was saying there's a fundamental problem in measurement in clinical medicine, particularly with respect to older multimorbid patients. Right? We don't have the right way of conceptualizing or thinking about it. We have to actually radically invert the pyramid. And that's what that narrative story was about. It was being directed by Mrs. G, not me thinking that any of my smug joke used to be to my patients. "So what's your disease and your comorbidity today?" "What do you mean, Dr. Upshur?" "Well, you've got 7 chronic conditions on my shelf." Back in those days were 7 clinical practice guidelines, all of which would take a little bit of you, your diabetes counts, but not your depression. And so that was the joke. The joke was, of course, that there was no, and we actually published a nice piece in the Canadian Family Physician that showed with residents from our clinic that showed that, the guideline world doesn't make sense. And I wrote a commentary. Do clinical practice guidelines make sense? And I argued no, which makes me a heretic, right? Quite clearly. So why would I be interested in tools? So the other tradition, contrary to evidence-based medicine, is clinometrics. And Alvin Feinstein, who is largely regarded as one of the founders of clinical epidemiology, but his way of thinking got displaced by evidence-based medicine in the 90s. And he wrote a beautiful series of book called Clinical Judgment in the 60s. And then he wrote another book that has really strongly influenced me called Clinometrics. So he was pushing back, and this man knew more about mathematics and statistics because clinical judgment starts with Boolean algebra, right? And just as full disclosure, back in the day, I used to be an instructor in logic, right? And so then I got to thinking, and he makes this great point about the APGAR score, and that the APGAR score has no statistical properties, right? But everybody knows what an APGAR means because it's based on it. All it does is distill clinical observation and put it in a form that people under duress can say, "I need to be worried. I don't need to be worried." Right?
So our non-clinicians listening, APGAR is what we do when babies are born, right? We measure. Yeah.
And Virginia APGAR is the one who came up. So I got obsessed with this, and I wanted the Jerry APGAR. I wanted a clinical tool that I could use to teach residents and others how to assess a complex, multimorbid older adult, and not go down the rabbit hole of thinking, I have to take a history and get them into a clinical pathway and then go into up to date and find out what grade says, or get you into warp the history. This was me observing generation of medical students and residents, and I could start to see how they were reasoning. The idea was you ask a few questions and get them to a clinical pathway, and then down they go, and bing, out comes the answer. And I'm going like, no, not with these patients. That doesn't work. It doesn't serve them well.
Yeah.
So that's where we started that was the tool that we were after, because we thought it would be a clinometrically valid tool. But the other interesting thing about this study, we designed this study as a self-defeating study because we asked for the clinicians to give their gestalt view of what they thought. So we actually did this in a series of family practices around Southern Ontario and in Prince Edward Island. So we had rural, urban, we had academic, non-academic physicians. And we were looking mostly at people over the age of 70 who were multimorbid. And we asked the physicians, how long have you known the patient? How worried you? And what turned out, we've had trouble getting this paper published, is that physicians' judgment, their gestalt judgment of what the patient's status was and where they would be in a year was about as good as the tool that we developed. And to me, it was a vindication of clinical judgment and clinician experience. But that's not a narrative that's particularly welcome these days, because everything has to be based on grade-based recommendations. And I actually had the great fortune of having a discussion with Gord Guyot. He got the Friesen Award, and my dean asked me to convene a panel, and he gave his lecture on the history and the future prospects of evidence-based medicine. And I asked him because he made this observation that, because to his credit, he's still a practicing general internist. He said, a lot of my patients are, older and multimorbid, because if anybody looked at a medicine ward, it's my people, right? And I said, so tell me, we're never going to have enough RCTs to, and I came to this conclusion 20 odd years ago, that there is no permutation and combination of RCTs that will ever provide direct evidence on how to manage a multimorbid, and they're not even senior anymore, right? Multimorbidity is the rule, not the exception. That was another thing we documented in our research, is that the complexity of patients starts in middle age. Actually, multimorbidity starts in people's 20s and 30s. I'm kind of ranting now. So without RCTs, how are we going to manage them? Right? And that's when he said, this is a horizon for evidence-based medicine. Well, it's a horizon been around for a long time, because the big problem is that all of the RCTs will provide they're defaulted by grade standards by indirectness, which means that clinical judgment is going to play a massive role in how we actually manage these patients. And what is the element of clinical judgment that we need? It's right back where he started, the capacity to take a history. And you can't get a patient's preferences by getting a checklist, right? You got to know the patient, right?
Yeah.
And then you can deal with all of this was a paper we published in the Canadian Family Physician 12, 13 years ago. What's good for the disease might not be good for the patient. And that means that we need to think about deliberation and dialogue as the means of coming to a decision about what to do. And in another essay, we might just need to abide. You've probably had this experience. I can't tell you the number of patients I was getting where they'd seen all the top specialists and they'd say, well, I've discharged this patient back to your capable. One of them I remember I saw with you, to your capable hands, right? Like, what am I supposed to do? All the evidence-based solutions have been tried, and yet the patient still has symptoms and problems, right?
Yeah.
So what does it mean to abide and be with a patient and just try your best by giving care? Like, is the chatbot going to listen to them?
Yeah.
So that to me is the big horizon that we haven't been able to meet. And yet we were unable to get continued research funds to do. The reason I said I researched my way out of practice is we developed this interprofessional model of care. We started at Sunnybrook, we developed it, we piloted it. It was interesting because everybody liked it, right? The clinicians liked it because you can share your epistemic and moral uncertainty about what to do with this very complex patients. Patients liked it because we took time, and time is what we have abandoned, taking the time that's necessary to understand. And we brought caregivers in, right? And often the caregiver was only slightly less multimorbid than the patient themselves. And they were holding huge. We used to say it was like Barbara Walters. We'd take the history, we'd send the resident in, take the history. We would all watch and listen. And then the social worker would come in and talk to the caregiver. And within 5 minutes at every meeting, the caregiver was in tears. And it took about 45 minutes to break down the barriers to find out what was really going on. And once I'd practiced in that way, I couldn't go back to the, going to see, nobody trained me how to see 10 octogenarians in a row with 10-minute appointments. I just felt like I was not providing the best possible care.
Yeah. So one of the concepts that you write about is I think you coined the term, the inferential gap between evidence and practice. Yeah. And that's what you're talking about there, right? With your comments about Gordon Guyatt.
And so that indirectness is a huge inferential gap. If your belief that the best and most certain evidence is directly an RCT directly on this particular question, you're not going to get it.
Yeah. And then just again, for our non-medical listeners, RCT, randomized controlled trial.
Yeah.
And in evidence-based medicine land, people say that if you aren't a firm believer, a true convert to EBM, to the EBM faith, then you really shouldn't be in medicine at all. And so the truth, the certain truth in our minds nowadays is the RCT. And so that speaks to the hierarchy of evidence. And now you're saying here, Dr. Upshur, that, well, in the case of an inferential gap where we can't apply, and on top of that, where we don't even have RCTs, they won't exist. Are you saying that we need to invert the hierarchy and go back to patient stories?
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly the conclusion I ended with. So, it's not that I'm anti-RCTs. I quite like them. But what does an RCT provide? It's an average value of an effect size. But it doesn't tell, even if you get, there's no drug that has a number needed to treat of 1 that works for everybody. We work with probabilities and uncertainties. And oftentimes what an RCT gives you is, I'll use some technical philosophical language, is a defeasible warrant, right? It gives you a reason to try something, but it doesn't guarantee success by any stretch of the imagination. And you need to be just like when you order a test. They all have sensitivity, specificity, false positives, and false negatives. So we've delimited the uncertainty to a certain extent, but this is where clinical judgment comes in, we always need to be wary of the drug might not work, the test might be a false negative or a false positive, and how are we going to manage that uncertainty? And that's where that relationship with the patient comes in. If you can convince them that medicine is thoroughgoingly imprecise and fallible, not what they read about or see on television.
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts come to mind. We mentioned Gadamer just earlier, and you put me onto this book, The Enigma of Health. And in his first chapter, he has this quote, and I'm picking up halfway through a long sentence. Quote, "The more rationally the organizational forms of life are shaped, the less is rational judgment exercised and trained among individuals," end quote. And then jumping ahead, quote, the more strongly the sphere of application becomes rationalized, the more does proper exercise of judgment, along with practical experience in the proper sense of the term, fail to take place, end quote. And so this gets back to my question about clinical tools, AI, and actually changing the environment of clinical care, but not just changing the environment, changing the physicians themselves.
Yes.
And just before you comment on that, in one of your articles that I just mentioned, you noted, or perhaps Ben noted, that a fair bit of research shows now that medical residents, they actually want the summaries and scorecards. Just give me the answer, give me the freaking AI.
Yeah.
And they don't want to become clinical epidemiologists, right? In the 1990s, that's when I trained, right? It was like, okay, maybe I should get my ClinEpi, master's in ClinEpi. And no, doctors don't want that. And so have we lost, and you shared another article with me about the good doctor and doing philosophy actually instead of learning about philosophy. Is there any road back to clinical judgment if we're so reliant on these tools, and these tools and AI are actually changing the environment, changing us as clinicians? How do we get back?
Yeah, the pessimist in me says there is no way back. The optimist in me holds that maybe all of the residents that I trained who are younger than me may still hold a flame for or a flicker of hope for a more thoughtful way of practicing medicine. I think Gadamer is absolutely correct on this point. And even though artificial intelligence, large language models, machine learning wasn't on the horizon when he was writing that, he understood what the process of what he calls rationalization implies. And it goes back to Heidegger and this enframing, right? Once you're enframed, it's really hard to question the frame itself because the frame shapes your experience and understanding of the object. And I think that's exactly what's happening. And I think it did start with evidence-based medicine because they had this very, as I call it, you're a patient, you're here to see me. My job is to extract information from you, go out and critically appraise and find something, and then come back and apply it to you, right? Like the extract and apply model. Not to engage in that sort of, as Gadamer would say, in a dialogical understanding of who you are as a patient and, who I am as a clinician with my finitude, the limitations of my understanding. And this notion from Gadamerian hermeneutics of the fusion of horizons as a form of understanding, and I wrote about this in an early paper, that the clinical encounter is an opportunity for a fusion of horizons. My understanding of what I think you are, and your understanding of what you think is going on and needs to be done. And that's really different from the pure objectivism, reductionism of evidence-based medicine. And it's not radical subjectivity, anything goes, right? It's actually a meaningful union of what it means to understand somebody's life and to try to understand them. That makes any sense at all.
No, I love that. So I'm scribbling quickly. A fusion of horizons makes me think of intentionality and phenomenology. It's our ability to hold ideas about something else. And so you as a clinician are coming with ideas about the patient. The patient is coming with ideas about the clinical encounter.
Yeah.
And that's actually where clinical practice exists. And we try to decode that into a bunch of lab tests and think, oh, now we've got the real answer. We've got the lab test. And actually we haven't. Sorry, go ahead.
To pick up some more Gadamerian terms. So she argues that, he's writing more on a broader philosophical scale, but in a clinical encounter, you have presuppositions, as we would call them, right? Or foreunderstandings or pre-understandings, or you might call them assumptions.
Or givens.
Or things that you think are happening, and the patient has the things that they think are happening. And the idea of the fusion of horizons is to work out the presuppositions to come to some new common understanding. Hopefully, there's always the possibility of misunderstanding. Yeah. And the other Gadamerian thread that I'm still quite persuaded by is his notion of phronesis or practical wisdom. And that's where the exercise of judgment in practical affairs goes way back to Aristotle. And he writes a lot about that in the Enigma Hell and quite extensively in Truth and Method. So these are, I think, useful concepts for an alternative view of what it means to practice medicine in the early 21st century that may be vanishing,
Yeah.
But I don't think it will be completely exterminated, I hope.
No. Yeah, and that fusion of horizons, I like that concept because it ties into Gadamer's emphasis of tactfulness, and the need to actually listen to the other person that you're talking to.
Yep.
You have a Gadamerian quote. You say, quote, "The path to all knowledge leads through the question."
Yes.
End quote. But you mentioned phronesis, and so phronesis and technique. So these Aristotelian terms, different kinds of knowledge, that just gets me really, really excited. So in medical school is a blast. I loved it. So we're learning all this book knowledge, episteme, or I called it episteme. I think it's supposed to be episteme, but knowledge that is certain, it's propositional, It's not contingent, so we can hang on to it. So that's the learning experience. But then on the practical experience, when you actually try to care for patients, knowledge, it's not propositional. It's contingent on, okay, did I actually get a good history? Are they actually telling me the truth? Am I, not had enough coffee today? Am I thinking clearly?
Yeah.
So it's probabilistic, and it's a huge amount of uncertainty there.
Yes.
And so people try to dismiss all that. Oh, well, that's just art. That's just the art. Come on, Shawn, get back to your AI clinical tools and get back to certainty. Have you been able to get your colleagues to admit that, no, we're talking about a philosophical gap here. We're not just talking about the woolly fuzzy part of, talking to patients. You're talking about actually something that is hard. And if we want, phronesis is equally a propositional thing as episteme.
Yeah.
And yet it seems like people won't admit that. So
No,
have you,
I tend to grind people down. It usually takes a year of courses with me before people will grudgingly admit they've been persuaded otherwise. And it does require some hard work and thinking. It means that most people's prima facie understanding of what certainty, objectivity, subjectivity, all of those concepts are fairly rudimentary and don't really stand up to close scrutiny. And I think, in the very first paper that I published in Philosophy of Medicine, there was a big debate, and there was a journal called the Journal of Evaluation in Clinical Practice. And every year they would have this philosophical analysis of evidence-based medicine. But I was disagreeing with both sides, with the editors of the journal and the proponents of evidence-based medicine, claiming that they both got things wrong. So I published a paper on because they were on probability and what's called abductive inference. So stemming from Charles Saunders Peirce, who was a philosopher that I didn't have much time for when I was studying philosophy. But when I became a researcher and a clinician, I really started to appreciate Peirce. And he was a thoroughgoing fallibilist. And I now give a lecture to the medical students on uncertainty. That took me 15 years to get into the curriculum. And he has this great quotation where he says, "Our knowledge swims, as it were, on a continuum of uncertainty and fallibility." I think I messed up the quotation there. But it's true. We swim in this sea of uncertainty. Our best beliefs are ones that we hold. And Peirce argued that the hallmark of a scientific mind was the willingness to throw over their complete wagon full of beliefs when they were no longer sustainable in light of what we've learned. But we never get to that final resting place of, the Kantian apodictic certainty or the Cartesian certainty. We are stuck with uncertainty. Not stuck with, it's constitutive of our existence on this planet. And my fear about artificial intelligence is this pseudo certainty that it's going to persuade people that we know more than we actually do, or that we can actually ever learn.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So you use that term abductive inference, and you used it in one of your articles, and I neglected to actually figure out for my own mind what that. So what exactly? So abductive. Go ahead.
Yeah. So if you look at the history of logic and the pursuit of certainty, it's this quest for forms of inference that never let us down. Go back to our beloved geometry, where there were axioms. And for several thousand years, it was believed that those axioms uniquely constitute the spatial nature of reality. Kant believed it, Newton to a certain extent. And only in the late 19th century, when non-Euclidean geometries were postulated because of the very wonky fifth axiom, right? That it turned out it worked for the new physics, for relativity physics. So this notion that we could have modes of inference, either deductive, and a deductive system starts with axioms, then rules of inference, and then you can elaborate, great complexity from that. Most pronounced in Russell and Whitehead's attempt to axiomatize mathematics in the Principia Mathematica. If you've ever spent time reading that, it takes like 240 or 400 pages to show that 2 + 2 = 4. Well, that book called Logicism was found to be faulted because of Gödel's proof, and he showed that for any axiomatic system, there will be propositions that are true but not provable, and provable but not true, and that paradox kind of opened things up. So now we're in a situation where deductivist approaches don't get you to that solid ground of certitude. So what's the other one? So you've got induction. You observe a large number of instances and you build up laws. So that's the Baconian tradition of inductive logic. But then there's you postulate that all swans are white, but then you find a black swan. So there's issues of confirmation or disconfirmation. Peirce kind of cut through that and said, what we're looking for, and the other way of understanding abduction is inference to the best explanation given what we know.
So Bayes.
Well, he's not fully Bayesian, but he does have, and he liked randomized trials too, and he thought a lot about probability. But abduction kind of leaves you with defeasible or provisional warrant to believe something. And I believe, and I've been working for a long time but haven't completed it, this notion of clinical reasoning as a defeasible. So if I wanted to put a formalism to it, and really up my philosophical creds, I'd do the defeasible logic for clinical reasoning, because it's true. You're always holding something, and even if you think you've got a firm diagnosis, a good clinician always goes to bed with a little seed of doubt that it could be wrong. And understanding under what conditions you would start to doubt that and rethink the problem. So this notion of defeasibility, fallibilism, or abductive inference kind of holds for me as a kind of theory of clinical reasoning.
So as you were explaining that, I don't know if I was having ESP or if I was remembering this exact answer that you gave in the late 1990s when I asked you the same question and forgot the answer.
Yeah, I did a lot of work up until about 2005, 2000. And it seemed pointless to continue, right?
Oh, it's brilliant. So it ties perfectly into where I wanted to go, and I wanted to get your thoughts on positivism. So a lot of what you're talking about sounds like logical positivism. I guess that's Auguste Comte. What are your thoughts on positivism as a framework in which most physicians, at least in my mind, still think and see the world of medicine?
Yeah, I think it's, despite it being rather, as a philosophical and epistemological doctrine, been rather thoroughly discarded about
100 years ago.
A long time ago. It's the self-understanding of our profession. And that's where I think I recommended Catherine Montgomery's Hunter's book about that. And she just says it's in the training, because she embedded herself in a medical school. We train clinicians to positive self-certainty at the cost of not recognizing our need to be good interpreters of the experience of our patients. And I think AI just fuels and falls in with that line of traditions in medicine.
Yeah. No, brilliant. So we're getting down to the end. I was going to ask you questions about Flexner Report in 1910 and healthcare versus patient care and as a term, but we won't go there. Instead, I'm going to ask you what I ask everybody, because this has been a fairly heavy talk. What keeps you awake at night? One guy I asked, he said, "Oh, my 1-year-old child does." I said, no. When you think about medicine, about medical education, where we're going as an industry, if we can call it that, what bothers you that I haven't been asking you about?
Well, as my spouse will say, I worry about everything. Here. It's not hard. So what I've tried to train myself, not successfully, is if I wake up in the night, don't start thinking. And I do. So, I'm awake almost every night worrying about one thing or another. But since I'm no longer involved in patient care, my nightly wakings are not dominated by questioning every patient that I'd seen the day before in clinic, that I really, maybe Mrs. So-and-so has X and not Y, and I did really right. Like I used to stay awake for hours worrying
Yeah.
about every single patient, and then I'd go in first thing in the morning and call them, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Are you still alive? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot about the world keeps me awake. And my worries may not be the worries of everyone. But I think in terms of the future of medicine, the one thing that really worries me, and it's germane to our discussion, and I gave a talk about this at the Brochet Foundation in Switzerland last year, which is a think tank for bioethics. And it was what I call I wanted to call it the Grand Inquisitor meets AI, but somebody it was actually a literature professor, had published this because they had noticed they'd been teaching Dostoevsky for like decades. And all of a sudden they were getting all of these essays that said, today, in this essay, I will delve into Dostoevsky. It's just like, I'd never seen anybody use the word delve into. And that's when he realized that students were turning in essays from large language models. So I was interested in what's called a particular bias, an automation bias that's pervasive and will become more pervasive in medicine as we start to rely increasingly on AI tools, that we're going to actually abdicate our authority. And then I found there's a great philosopher, Arne Naess, he's an interesting guy. He started as a logical positivist, and he was in the part of the Vienna Circle, came back to Oslo, where he became the research professor of philosophy. And he's a mountain climber. And he used to spelunk out the outside of the building and enter in through the window on the 10th floor, apparently, of the philosophy department there. And then he got interested was the founder of what's called deep ecology. But he has this argument that he calls the abdication argument. And he's envisioning a future species of aliens comes to our planet. And would it not be correct if they were more perfect than us in every regard to just abdicate to them? And then I raised the question is, when will we start to think that AI is the sort of entity that we as humans ought to abdicate all of our judgment over to? And I think that's the big question that keeps me awake at night. It's so ubiquitous and intrusive. I can't turn on my computer now without getting a co-pilot, or we'll summarize this paper for you, Dr. Upshur. Look, no, I want to read it for myself, and increasingly my colleagues are using it in research. Oh yeah, it makes things so easy. But has the point of human existence been for it to be easy? Or is struggling to understand something with your own limited resources the task of living? And I don't know the answer to that question. I know the answer for me would be, because I still don't use AI tools. But, we're a big planet with a lot of people, and everybody seems to want this. So that's what keeps me awake.
Yeah, well said. When you talk about AI being ubiquitous, I think it was Michael Hanby I was listening. He's a philosophy of science guy. And he said, I can't even drive across town now and find my way back because my little maps app gets me there and gets me back. Whereas he said before, this was a skill that we all had.
Yeah.
He said before smartphones, he said, I would have 100 phone numbers memorized or more. That was nothing. He said, now I have a hard time even remembering my own phone number. I just don't memorize them. And so now the data people would say, oh, that's a good thing. Look how much we're helping you. I'm not entirely sure. I think we're losing something in that process.
Yeah, and I don't use Google Maps for directions. I read the map and figure out what I think is the best way there.
Yeah.
But won't follow it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Dr. Upshur, this has been really, really fascinating. Your comment about waking up in the night, second guessing your patient care. It's funny. I've just now done most of the last couple of years writing, so seeing very, very few patients. And lo and behold, I stopped having nightmares about patient care. So literally for 30 years, every night I had a nightmare about something. Usually it was I couldn't read my writing on a chart, or I couldn't find the lab values, and I thought, Wow, is this an experience some people actually have where they don't have nightmares about work every night?
Well, I think we should, because being a physician is a very weighty responsibility, fraught with uncertainty and peril. And people's depending on you to exercise your best judgment. And I think we've forgotten just how weighty and difficult that responsibility is to bear. And we're looking for easier solutions.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for having the time here.
It was great to see you and great to speak with you. I hope it was of some value.
Oh, huge. Absolutely. Have a great day, sir.
Yeah, you too.